about multilingualism, and the question I'm asking, is it a soft skill or social practice? Okay. This is the outline of my today's talk. First, I will talk about language as social practice. So our current understanding of language in sociolinguistics and a lot of corresponding notions as well. Then I want to talk about dominant language ideologies that structure our language pedagogy and structure language policy. Then I will tell a little bit more about the case of Kazakhstan. So what is the data, what is happening in terms of multilingualism, and I'll particularly want to stop on language proficiency and different access to different linguistic resources, including literacy resources. And it finishes with concluding remarks, and I'll do my best to stay on time. But I think at any instructor, I over-prepared, and probably it's too much material, but we'll see. Okay, so we'll start with language as a social practice, and what do we know in sociolinguistics? First, I'd like to start with the notion of language. Okay, and then previously, and actually in a lot of our everyday understanding of language, we distinguish one language from another based on two characteristics. First of all, on the basis of structure. We know, for example, that English is structurally different from German, or Uzbek is structurally different from Kazakh. However, we also know that there are so many languages out there that are mutually intelligible and very, very similar to each other. For example, Hindu and Urdu, or a lot of languages of former Yugoslavia, which are mutually intelligible, yet they're considered different languages. And then comes other factors which play a role when we start distinguishing languages. And we do that on the basis of a lot of social factors, for example, national borders, cultural borders, religious borders, and so on and so on. So the definition of language is not as easy and transparent as it may appear to a lot of laymen. And when we think of languages, we know there is Kazakh, we know there is Russian, but sociolinguistics is really questioning whether there are languages, like languages actually exist. And also, kind of up until now in sociolinguistics and a lot of linguistic research, we would distinguish dialects and standards. So standard is basically one of the dialects has speakers of which have more power. And distinguishing languages also comes with sort of complexities, because we can talk about dialect continuum, we can talk about issues like mutual intelligibility and linguistic distance. What do I mean here? There are some languages, some varieties of languages could be mutually unintelligible, like for example, some dialects of German, but yet they're considered one language. And then you have different languages which are mutually intelligible, for example, Kazakh and Karakalpak, or Russian and Belarusian. People do understand each other, yet they're considered different languages. So, but with time, we feel, for political reasons, you decide that we're actually talking about two different languages, then linguistic distance grows, as it happened between Swedish and Norwegian. However, lately, what sociolinguistics started doing, they started questioning the notion of language altogether. Why? Because we've managed to collect more and more empirical data, actually data from everyday conversations, everyday interactions. And then you realize that what we have in our heads and the way we imagine languages doesn't actually correspond to what how we use languages in real life, in everyday conversations. And for example, Blumer and Rampton in 2011, here are the quotes from them. So they're saying that they're critically reanalyzing the idea that there are distinct languages, and that the proper language is bounded, pure, and composed of structural sounds, grammar, and vocabulary. And so there's things that are designed for referring things. Okay? And what they're saying is that, and not just them, a lot of sociolinguists are saying that individual languages are actually ideological constructions, and they're historically tied to the emergence of the nation state in the 19th century. So the building nation state and emergence of national languages actually go hand in hand. And also what we see in the recent literature, in the critical literature, critical sociolinguistics, people are saying that actually us linguists played a huge role in differentiating, codifying, and linking a language with a people. And they say that linguistic scholarship itself played a major role in the development of the European nation state, as well as the expansion and organization of empires. So language is not innocent tool, neutral tool of communication. A language is an ideological construct, and it has a particular social function, and that appears when there is a need in it. And also, along with that, along with questioning the notion of language, we also question the concept of a native speaker. And in literature, you will see so-called native speaker fallacy, when what sociolinguists are saying is that such notions as native speaker, mother tongue, and ethno-linguistic group are given as a priori classifications. And reality does not necessarily correspond to these notions. And Kazakhstan is a great example when you have people who claim that their mother tongue, they're native speakers of Kazakh, and their mother tongue is Kazakh, and they are ethnic Kazakhs. Nevertheless, for second or third generation in some urban families, they no longer speak Kazakh. Or you have, for example, oral monks who also claim that they're ethnic Kazakhs, but at home they use Chinese, and Chinese is the dominant language. Also, Pinnacock in 1994 goes further, saying that our native speaker is also an ideology, linguistic ideology, and it's actually three different ideologies. One is a belief that there is a close correspondence between holding a citizenship and being a native speaker. And we've seen it in a lot of contexts, in nation building contexts, where a certain land is considered a land of certain ethnic group speaking a particular language, and Kazakhstan is not exception. And I would say like probably all of post-Soviet, post-imperial contexts are very, very similar in the way they build their national identity. Also, there is another notion which is linked to a native speaker and an ideal native speaker, is that language is homogeneous in a fixed system, that there is this ideal language and there is some ideal speakers out there who can actually speak that ideal language. Empirical evidence shows they don't exist. And also the idea of being a native speaker implies high level of competence in all languages and domains. And yet we know this is not true, because competence can vary considerably, even for native speakers, leave alone bilingual and multilingual speakers. So we can talk about maximal competence, partial competence, minimal competence, and sometimes just recognizing competence when people hear and they can say, oh, this is German and this is English, or this is Uzbek, this is Kazakh, this is Korean, this is Chinese. So not necessarily actually understanding what people are saying. Moreover, we all know from our own experience that not all multilingual native speakers would successful if measured against the norm of the educated native. And again, we see plenty of examples of that when people are native speakers of a particular language, but yet they are lacking functional literacy. They cannot complete certain forms. They cannot read difficult newspaper articles. They cannot read prescriptions or instructions, and they cannot handle more difficult academic reading tasks or academic writing tasks. So what this complexity allows to do us, so instead of traditional notion of speech community, sociolinguists nowadays talk about linguistic repertoire. And repertoire, it's all means of speaking. And it's a quote from Blumer and Bascos 2011, that all those means that people know how to use and why they communicate. And such means, as we've seen, range from the linguistic ones, language varieties, over cultural ones, genres and styles, and social ones, norms of the production and understanding of language. And I already gave you some examples when native speakers do not have, they, for example, speak only basic vernacular variety of language, but are not familiar with more cognitively demanding genres and styles, and they're not necessarily familiar with certain norms of production in particular for particular activity types. Okay. Okay. And also what kind of became almost a common sense in sociolinguistics, we stopped talking about identity as something solid, something you know. So what we do, we talk about identities as something more like much more fluid and much more fragmented. Okay, and what we do instead, we now focus and study the ways in which people take on different linguistic forms and how they align and disaffiliate with different groups at different moments and stages. So what we do in our everyday life, you don't go around saying I'm Kazakh in every single context, or I am a woman. What you do in some situations, you're a little bit more Kazakh than in others. And in some situations, you're a little bit more female than in others. So what you do, you affiliate and disaffiliate constantly, and your identity is so much more fragmented at a particular time, but it also changes over time. So it's a lifelong process, the way you see yourself and the way you identify yourself and the way you use languages. Everything is so much more fluid within our ideology of language and a native speaker led us to believe. And Heller, in 2007, she goes further, saying that when we studied bilingualism and we study multilingualism, we used to view bilingualism as coexisting of two linguistic systems. What she says is that, so these views are resolutely committed to a paradigm in which languages are understood as a whole bounded system associated moreover with whole bounded communities. For example, Kazakhs living in Kazakhstan speak Kazakh. Okay? Russians living in Russia speak Russian, and so on and so on. And what she does, she proposes a reorganization that views bilingualism as a complex set of practices which draw on linguistic resources that have been commonly, conventionally thought as belonging to two different systems. So, and it's not just Heller, there's a lot of sociolinguistic research out there, especially research in multilingual, which shows that our multilingual practice is not just one language and another language, and we choose between languages. Very often we mix languages, and these mixed varieties, sometimes in literature you see terms like translanguaging, sometimes you see medium of talk. There are varieties of their own, and this is the way we talk, and this is the way we interact. And the way we choose our repertoire, so for example, I don't know, me for example, yeah, a person who has a wide linguistic repertoire. So I have access to, my repertoire includes academic English. I can read and write in academic English. I can read lectures like that. But I also have conversational English, and I have access to conversational Kazakh. My public speaking in Kazakh, though I would find it extremely difficult because I'm not accustomed. It's not part of my social practice. It's not something I've been socialized to do. And then I have Russian, the whole range of Russian register styles and norms of talking. So what sociolinguists are saying, we should stop seeing languages and native speakers and comparing multilinguals to monolinguals. So it's a monolingual bias. And instead of language, you should start talking more about linguistic repertoires. And I repeat again, there are a lot of native speakers out there whose linguistic repertoires are extremely limited. They are limited to vernacular, to everyday, like basic conversational skills, and they lack skills in academic, in a more cognitively demanding academic language, or even lack functional literacy, cannot do simple literacy tasks. So highly proficient bilinguals not only have access to different registers in different languages, but they also have access to different literacy types and different literacy activities in different languages. So they are multi-literate as well. And while we have while sociolinguistics has moved on considerably for the last 20, 30 years in the way we understand languages, in the way we understand native speakers, and in the way we understand competence in learning languages, yet, if you look at across the world, if you look at a lot of states and language policies, then you will see that a lot of language policies around the world based on an ideology of a native language. Okay? Especially in post-colonial, post-imperial contexts like ours, when we're trying to build a nation of our own independent nation state. And so Kazakhstan language policy is driven by the nationalist discourse, constructing Kazakhstan as a land of Kazakhs who speak Kazakh. Okay, and if you analyze our language policy, do discourse analysis of our documents, you will see, and it's quite transparent, it's quite visible, that language policy has been strongly motivated by a perceived need to promote Kazakh, which during the Soviet time occupied relatively peripheral position, and make this national language, make Kazakh as a national language of a new nation state. And our government did play by a rule book of language policy, because our language policy has all the necessary components described in literature. So restoring Kazakh involved status and corpus planning, and you can see that language and education planning, introducing Kazakh as a required second language and teaching some of the subjects in Kazakh in Russian medium schools, increasing number of Kazakh medium schools, and also to a lesser degree, prestige building. Here we still need to work a little bit more. And this ideology of national language is based on ideas of primordial identity, that you are born into some classification that is given, is a priori. And it also relies on a notion of intrinsic value of language learning. So it's important, it's a part of your identity. So you learn language because you want to identify yourself with a particular group. So on one hand, in a lot of modern states, we see this ideology for like almost everywhere, even in the United States. Okay? The people still use these ideologies, and people still argue against using minority languages, against using Spanish, based on that idea that English is the language of the citizens. However, what we also see recently, and again, it's not just happening in Kazakhstan, it's happening all around the world, what Park call, I'm gonna hear several slides. I'm gonna talk about Park's 2015 article, because I think he gave such a nice critical analysis of the situation. So he talks about new language ideology, and this new language ideology is conquering the world. It came along with the idea of globalization. And here, and it's the ideas of neoliberalism and neoliberal subject. And it's this ideology relies on the following tenets: ideas of human capital and realization of potential capabilities. Okay, and then what we see, language is no longer viewed as a part of your identity. It's presented as a commodity, as a skill. Okay, so we see this reimagining of language. And in this understanding, language is deconstructualized, neutral and abstract tool of communication. Okay, and what Park calls it, so language then is constructed as a pure medium of potentiality, and that he further explains what he means by that. Okay, so he says that in a lot of language policies, in a lot of public discourse around the world, we more often see this, that language is viewed as a powerful means of realizing the potential ability of individuals in the global stage. Okay, so you have to learn English, so you become part of the global global human capital, or you can participate in global markets, or you can go and study abroad, or you can so all this mobility and fluidity in modern society. And also what he says, and I really like this quote, and if you allow me, I will read it. Okay, so it can enable the speaker to perform and realize potential within a wider area beyond that defined by one's provenance. In other words, multilingualism is seen as facilitating full realization of the speaker's potential mobility by allowing the speaker to move beyond the constraints of the culture and community, reaching many people and traversing multiple markers to explore great opportunities, no longer stifled by the boundaries imposed by essentialized identity and becoming whatever she needs to be. So there is an idea that anyone can become anyone as long as they invest and motivate it and do something about it. Okay, so this idea of neoliberal subject, where for whom language and communication is reimagined as major soft skills, it allows this neoliberal subject to flexibly adapt to constant changing demands of the world. And what he says further is that multilingualism acquires new meaning as an index of an ideal neoliberal subject, striving to improve herself, never been satisfied with what she has achieved, but always searching for new ways to further maximize the value of her own human capital. Okay? And within that, language learner is investing in a valuable skill. Language learning becomes a technology of the self, and investing in language learning becomes as important as actual competence. And this is quite ironic, because what Park says, if you look at a lot of language courses around the world, there's so many people engaged in language learning, especially learning English, but their proficiency is not important. It's not really much, it's not improving much. So, and that allows us to say that investing in language development becomes, and investing in language learning becomes just as important as actual competence. So you are engaged in activity is enough for you to be considered this ideal neoliberal subject. And what Parker then says that of course this neoliberal argument is fallacious, okay? Because it's based on the idea that ability innocent of experience, and it is fiction. Language is not an abstract and neutral communication tool. Instead, language is deeply embedded in human action. It does not exist as an external system that neutrally refers to social action. It is a form of social action itself. Okay? Language index and reproduce social constraints and social differences. Okay, because you open your mouth and immediately people can identify your social status. Yeah. And social status, and they can it's a marker of so many, it's an index of so many social characteristics. Then social conditions for language acquisition are not equally distributed, and those conditions are reproduced in different competences that result from them. So learning English in rural Kazakhstan and learning English in a prestigious elite school in Almaty are two different animals. Okay? Students in these schools have different access to English as a linguistic resource. Okay? Moreover, what this neoliberal argument hides is that not all kinds of ability to speak a given language are valued equally. Some ways of speaking are valued more than others. Okay, ability to speak and write, for example, academically, valued much more than speaking the vernacular. Okay, and moreover, or Park says is that this neoliberal ideology gives people false promise because it downplays social embeddedness of language. Okay? It hides inequalities. Okay? Inequalities in access, in inequalities of linguistic repertoires, inequalities of variety we speak, because with language, different language varieties, they have different social indexes. And it also hides the fact that language plays a very important role in reproducing these inequalities. It's erased in this discourse. And false promise of language learning is denied, okay? And I will show you examples of these arguments in in the case of Kazakhstan, okay? And I'm sure a lot of people here are familiar with our language education and in our education system. So we have two language streams, Kazakh medium and Russian medium. And otherwise it's an absolutely equivalent curriculum, and parents can choose whether to educate their kids in Russian or to educate their kids in Kazakh. We also have multilingual schools for ethnic minorities, but I'm not gonna talk about here now because it's slightly outside of my talk. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with our cultural program of triunity of languages that has been introduced in 2007, and then following multilingual education reform, which was introduced in 2016. This is the initial outline of the trilingual education. The Ministry of Education was trying to explain to the community and parents. Since then, the strong variant of the reform has been abandoned because it became clear we're not able to implement it. But initially, and we still have the same model in essence. So from grades 1 to 6, students are educated in the L1. Then in grade 7, they're supposed to introduce history in L2. For example, if you study in Russian school, then history of Kazakhstan would be in Kazakh language. And if you're studying in Kazakh school, then Всемирная история, world history, would be taught in Russian. My latest project, when I did interviews to schools and interviews to teachers or students, shows that it's still not being implemented. Also, this trilingual policy implied that in grades, from grades 1 to 9, English is taught as a subject. But then in grades 10 and 11, STEM subjects are taught in English. Okay? And to prepare for that, what government did, and you as policy educators, you know what they did is actually one of the characteristics of ineffective reforms. What they did, they changed the standard, and they made teachers to introduce the change standard. But very little was done to build multilingual schools, to help to build sustainable multilingual education and effective multilingual education. The motivation that the government gave when they introduced this policy was, they're saying is that multilingual education is a means of improving quality of education in order to modernize Kazakhstan, to produce global human capital, and here's neoliberal ideology, to create social and ethnic cohesion, here's a national argument, and ensure educational equity. Okay, and I will give you a quote from former Minister of Education, Yerlan Sagadiey. Okay, and for those who don't understand Russian, I will translate. What he said is that we see that youth who had the education in Kazakh medium schools in the future are limited in receiving quality higher education. For example, many young people, especially from rural areas, they have difficulties being accepted entering our top universities like Nazarbayev University, KMEP University, KPO2, or IT. Okay, those universities where education is a medium of instruction is English. And then he says, most important, most correct way solution for that would be to teach Kazakhstani youth, especially rural kids, to teach them English so they become fluent in English along with their native language. Okay, this would help them get knowledge, necessary knowledge, and it would open doors to the most prestigious universities, ours and in the world. Okay, so you can see and feel this neoliberal ideology behind everything is said here. Okay? And also, when people talk about multilingual education, trilingual education, the following constraints constantly discussed. They're constant part of our public discourse. People talk about poor teaching materials, they talk about inadequate teacher training, and they talk about limited resources, as this quote here. Russian language teachers don't know Kazakh, Kazakh language teachers don't know Russian, no one knows English, and after the PT professional development training, we are learning English because we have to learn English in 3 months. So that was in 2016 when the government was about to implement multilingual mass implementation of multilingual education. However, what is not discussed is structural factors. The factors of inequality, that not everyone has equal access to linguistic and other resources. And what is not questioned are our dominant language ideologies that actually structure our language and education policy. What I'd like to show you now is like a bits, snippets of 3 different projects I did, and I'll mention the names of the colleagues later. So first, we did, in spring 2016, we did an assessment of literary skills of 241 fourth graders in 9 randomly selected schools in Almaty. Oh, sorry, forgot the word. Then we did a survey of almost 3,000 high schoolers and 29 public secondary schools in Almaty, okay, in spring 2014. And I've just almost finished doing a consultancy work for the World Bank project, where we're doing evaluation of the multilingual education reform. I don't have the right to share the data yet, but I can tell you, like, informally about the results. And I hope the report is going to be published so everyone will be able to see the analysis. And that evaluation was based on interviews with experts, focus groups of students and parents, and survey of teachers, and also there's survey of citizens. The survey tool, when we did survey of high school students, we asked questions about education, we asked questions about language, then we asked about questions about like background, the personal questions. In total, there are 52 questions, and here are examples. Okay. Our literacy test we did, it contained background questionnaire, and the test itself had 4 parts, and we had 2 different text fiction and non-fiction. Non-fiction text came actually from their own textbook that they used in school, and fiction was a translated story from English. Why we did that? Because we wanted to make sure that the story is unfamiliar to the audience. And the literacy tasks we did, we tried to see how students are performing in expressing and judging an opinion, justifying an opinion, reading comprehension, retrieving and explicitly stated information, making straightforward inferences, demonstrating functional literacy, and demonstrated logical reasoning and argumentation. Okay, what we see in both studies in fourth graders and high schoolers is that there is a systematic imbalance in educational opportunities, particularly access to literary resources and opportunities to acquire literary skills. And also we see difference in proficiency in the medium of instruction. We see differences in literacy skills, and we see differences in parental language proficiency in various languages. Okay, so more specifically, students in Russian medium schools are more likely to come from more economically advantageous households. Twice as many students from the Russian medium schools attend tutorials, and twice as less to say that they're prepared specifically for UNT. Okay, so what we see in our data is that kids in Russian medium schools would start going to extracurricular activities and participating in shadow education earlier from secondary or even primary school, and they would go to art classes, to music, to sports, while a lot more kids from Kazakh medium schools would be participating in extracurricular additional lessons, paid tutorials, only in high school, and they would mainly focus on preparing for the UNT test. Also, what we see is that children, for example, just one of the bits of data, children from Russian-speaking schools report that they have bigger home libraries and they read more books for pleasure. So we can see these cultural differences. Okay, when it comes to literacy skills, okay, there are more students in Russian medium schools who use medium of interaction at home. So if you look at this data, if you look at our data, then you will see that kids from Russian medium schools are much more likely to report that they use Russian at home than kids in Kazakh medium schools. So for them, their medium of instruction was not necessarily their home language. So it was their second language. Okay, and bilingualism in Kazakh and Russian is high in Kazakh medium schools, and in Russian medium schools, more kids tend to be a lot more proficient in Russian or monolingual Russian speakers. Moreover, what we did on literacy test in our fourth graders, we actually didn't limit the time students could take required to do the test. So what we found that kids in Kazakh medium schools spend 25% more time than their peers in Russian medium schools. And yet, students from Kazakh medium schools performed worse in all parts of the test. Okay. And also, what our data shows that there is a differences in parental educational background and language proficiency in Kazakh and Russian medium schools. Okay, parents of Russian speakers are better educated. 80% of them are college educated versus 32% of college educated in Kazakh medium schools. And they were more likely to claim proficiency in English, 40% versus 17%. So it's also a good proxy of the socioeconomic status and the work they do. Okay, so what does it allow us to say about the data? Okay, so in a lot of discussion of national of nation states, the political structure of nation state, it's assigned particular language variety as a state language. Okay, so Kazakhstan, the state language is Kazakh. Okay, and in a traditional linguistic market, speaking this right sort of a language, speaking a national language or speaking an official language, is seen as indexical of being the right sort of person and gives access to the right sort of education, which in turn allows access to other economic and cultural resources. And in Kazakhstan, Kazakh is a state language and it is a language of majority of population. Yet what happens, we keep observing persistent social inequality running along language lines. So this Bourdieu model doesn't really work because we are in transition. So we've seen a rearrangement of linguistic hierarchy. Okay, and in sociolinguistics, when people analyze similar context, and very often you would find referring to situation like elite closure, when we observe deepening existing inequalities, and elite has access to more prestigious. They have more prestigious combinations of languages, genres, styles, and so on in their linguistic repertoires. So in Kazakhstan, for example, upper middle class people, many of them are fluent in English. They are fully fluent in standard Russian. And then and many of them have Kazakh as L2. And if they're not fluent, but at least they can read and write in Kazakh. Okay, so, but at the same time, well, it's a very important language in Kazakhstan. Many people in rural areas have limited access to it. And I would say that Russian becomes more and more a bourgeois resource. And a lot of people don't have access to, lower middle class people, because it's not part of their social practice. There are no speakers, Russian speakers in villages any longer. And so they don't have access to, and they don't have access also to more standard varieties of Russian. Okay? So what we see, I think that the language policy we have has unintentionally resulted in widening social differences and social inequality in this globalized new economy. And in our language education documents, the purpose of our trilingual policy is upbringing polylingual individual. Okay, so again, language is viewed as a soft skill. But it hides. You don't see anyone anywhere in the documents that we're trying to that language policy. They don't really talk about structural differences and access to different resources. And as Jazira Asanova in 2007, I really like this quote of hers. She says that education policymakers tend to view the reasons for the achievement gaps as residing within schools. And very often in Kazakhstan and in many other contexts, it's teachers who are blamed if students don't speak the language, if they don't learn the language. And rather than occurring due to structural inequalities, including inequalities in learning opportunities for privileged and disadvantaged students. Okay? And very often, including our language policy, it fails to address these inequalities, and significant barriers remaining in place. And we're talking about linguistic barriers, we talk about cultural barriers and institutional barriers. Okay, and people are given false promise of social mobility. When we did the citizen survey and we did focus groups with both students and parents, everyone was saying, English is so important. We have to learn English. This is so important for my social mobility. It will help me to gain a job. It will help me to gain good education. And so, but very few of them can actually have proper access to quality language education, and have access to conditions, structure in place to learn these languages. Okay, so for the future, so what should we do? Okay, so we have this situation. On one hand, we have very nationalistic language ideology. On the other hand, we have this new neoliberal subject. Okay, like everyone has a potential and everyone has to learn a language. We have to invest in languages. Moreover, from students, for example, you hear that teacher's role is not to teach us language. Okay, they only giving us direction. Okay, it's really up to us. We have to, if we're not motivated, then it's our fault that we don't have proficiency in particular languages. And a lot of non-native speakers of Kazakh, like new speakers of Kazakh, are often blamed for not speaking Kazakh. And again, they're blamed that they're not motivated enough, they're not investing enough effort to learn the language. And very few talk about structural issues in place. So to move forward, we need to more critically examine language practices of different types of learners, because we know very little. Okay, our sociolinguistics in Kazakhstan is quite still in nascent state. We really don't know what happens in classrooms. We don't know how students use languages. What does a student needs? What does a parental language use at home? Okay, there's so many things we need to know. How people use languages, for what purposes they use languages, what literacies they use, and for what functions they use literacies. Okay. And we also have to analyze critically what is the access of people, in particular students, to different linguistic resources. And our preliminary data shows that people have very different access to linguistic resources. They are not distributed evenly. Okay, in some remote AWULs, all students are here is conversational Kazakh. They don't even hear standard Kazakh, and they don't have literacy skills in Kazakh, and that's it. The linguistic repertoire is extremely limited, while other students have much wider access to various linguistic resources. We also need to investigate the position of a language within the global knowledge-based marketplace, and we need to see how both the language and its speakers are socially positioned with that language market. We also must much more critically look at sociolinguistic and socioeconomic consequences of language reforms, because at the moment, language reform mainly focuses on the language, but very little is talked about the causes of inequalities. Okay, and you hear this Kazakh speakers blaming Shala Kazakhs for not learning Kazakh, and that we need to close Russian medium schools, we should prohibit Russian, and so on and so on. But this is like conversation about languages actually hides that what people are trying to say, that there is a social inequality and we have to do something about it. Okay, so what they see, they understand that Russian speakers have power, like in Bardou sense, more power than Kazakh speakers, but then the whole entire conversation focuses on language only instead of focusing on other forms of inequality. And we need to much more closely, therefore, look at the effects of upscaling Kazakh in the context of expansion of existing political economies and globalization. So economy is there, but we're trying to do reform without changing much about the political economy. And we don't really understand how globalization and us trying to introduce this trilingual policy and making everyone learn English, how does it affect what effect it would have on Kazakh. And we ourselves, like policymakers and educators, need to critically review our dominant language ideologies and see how this dominant language ideology affect our pedagogical choices. Okay, and I'd like to end with thanking my co-authors, okay, who participated in the projects I mentioned. Dr. Elise An, who is currently Director of International Project Office at W Medicine, and my student and my colleague, Alia Zakupova, who is the Vice President of Teacher Education at National School for Physics and Math. Okay, here are the references, and thank you very much.